Hello and welcome to the screencast on production and growth. Um, Economic growth is a very important topic in economics. And why is it important? Well, because we're all affected by it. If the real GDP per person goes up, then it means living standards in the country go up. It means we're all better off, and we can all benefit from the fruits of the economy and the fruits of our labour more. So, how do we measure that? Well, we measure it usually by the growth rate of the economy, how fast the economy is growing, which of course depends on the number of goods and services the economy is producing. So we can measure that in terms of real GDP, that's the quantity of goods, and then averaging that out per person, and then taking a percentage change. So that's what we call the growth rate, the economic growth rate. And we can look at that over a year. So economists, particularly macroeconomists, are particularly interested in looking at what the economic growth rate for a country and looking at the determinants of that economic growth rate. Because some countries are growing much faster than others, China is a good example of a country that's grown in the last few years at rates that are above 9% increase in real GDP per capita per person. Then obviously China is zooming up the rankings of the countries in terms of their real GDP per person or real GDP per capita. And other countries, not doing so well, maybe are falling down the rankings. So, the rankings obviously differ through time as each country has, more economic growth than another country has. So here we can see the different kind of growth experiences that countries have had over more than a century. So you can see the type of real GDP per capita per person at the beginning of the period and at the end of the period. And that means that we can average that, as well over for each year, and that it gives those growth rates in the right-hand column. So you can see that Bangladesh, for instance, country next door to India, it hasn't grown particularly fast. It's only grown at an average of 0.78% a year, whereas Japan, for instance, over that period, although it's in a period of stagnation right now, over a century, it's actually grown one of the fastest countries. It's grown by 2.71%. A lot of that growth happened, by the way, after the Second World War. The US, you can see, is halfway down that table with a growth rate on average of 1.8% per annum. Mexico, interestingly, is higher up that table. And you can see China as well is slightly higher up the table than the US right now. But that's measuring over a century, remember. We've been over the 4 factors of production, so this is really review for you guys. So, obviously they are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. I'm not going to go into that any further. Remember that most countries have a fixed amount of land. There are a few exceptions, like the Netherlands, that have been reclaiming land over time, so their amount of land has been changing. But for the majority of countries, the amount of land they have is fixed. And entrepreneurship, that can change over time, but we're going to assume that it's relatively fixed. So really, what are the 2 factors of production left that through policy we can have an impact on? Well, it's labor and capital. And for both of these, of course, productivity, and we've defined this before, it's output per unit factor of production per period of time. So that's the definition of productivity, which I think we've already done earlier in the course. Obviously, productivity is an important part of allowing the output to grow, because what it means is that each factor of production produces more output. So Why is it important, productivity? Well, it's a key determinant of living standards, and second point there, it's the growth in productivity is the key determinant of growth in living standards. So changing living standards as well. And obviously, if we're changing living standards, it means output is going up, which through the national income accounting identity, you know, means that the income of the country is going up as well. So what are the determinants of productivity? If productivity is so important in determining growth, what's the determinants of productivity? Well, remember that in most cases, when we're looking at production processes, there is land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So in most cases, the labor is always working with machinery and equipment. So the actual machinery and equipment, the amount of it, we call the physical capital. But the important point about it is the technology embodied in the physical capital. So in other words, the quality of the capital. Same with the labor force. You know, you can count numbers, so you can add up how many people are in the labor force. That's all well and good, but really what matters in a way to productivity is the quality of the labor force, and that in economics we call human capital. And that is the knowledge and skills that workers have acquired through education, training, and experience. Also, natural resources are important. They're inputs into the production of goods and services, and they're provided, of course, by nature. And nature endows certain countries with a lot of natural resources. Texas, for instance, has a lot of oil. We're very lucky because of that. And you can compare that with a country like Japan, which has really no natural resources. So most of their gains in productivity obviously have come from technology improvements or from labor productivity improvements. Knowledge is also important, and it can be technical or other. In other words, just general know-how, savvy, ways of doing things, etc. So society's understanding of the best ways to produce goods and services is also an important input into productivity. Things like, I mean, you probably want an example of that, things like just-in-time inventory stocking. So in other words, trying to lower the amount of inventory you have. Why? Because inventory costs. Why? Because it means that you have to have, the higher the level of inventory, the higher the number of things you have stuck in a shelf or stuck in a warehouse waiting to be sold. If you can better predict how much you're going to sell, then you don't produce until, or you don't buy until you're ready, think you're ready, going to be ready to sell. So that kind of thing is one of the other ways in which knowledge can be important. Here we're going to look at a case study. So are natural resources a limit to growth? Well, the argument here is that natural resources will run down and run out eventually because there's only a fixed supply of them, and when they do so, the world's economies could grind to a halt. We have an example of that in the search by the current administration to fund, and they indeed subsidize, other sources of energy other than the traditional coal burning sources of energy and using oil. So that's one of the reasons why, for instance, we're using more wind-powered generators, and you see them all over Portland, for example. So we have a fixed supply of non-renewable natural resources. They will eventually run out if we keep on using them at the current rate. That could stop economic growth and force living standards to fall. But often what happens is, even when we run into one of these limitations, we run out of those natural resources, technology can help us avoid those limits or bypass those limits. So, for instance, with the amount of oil that we're putting out of the ground, if we can increase the miles per gallon on vehicles substantially, maybe by using hybrid vehicles or electric vehicles, then we'll improve our use of those natural resources over time. Recycling is another example, and also the use of new materials that haven't been used before in production can bypass the use of those old materials that are running out. So the question is, are these efforts enough to permit continued economic growth? Well, the alternative is to get the market to indicate, when some of these resources run out or are about to run out. And one of the things we should see is the price of those resources climbing, and that should be reflected in market prices. In other words, the scarcity of the resource. And we see that to a certain degree anyway in natural resource prices now. There are substantial short-run fluctuations in the price of natural resources. We're seeing that in gold lately. Gold has reached all-time highs, but it came off those highs. Same with silver, platinum as well. And but in the long run, that's short run, and in the long run, in the market for those particular raw materials or products, in fact, prices tend to be stable or falling. Obviously, the key here is to try and find ways to conserve those resources, because we know our demand for resources is increasing as the world's population is increasing, and try and ensure that we make those resources last as long as possible, particularly the non-renewable ones. The renewable ones, such as wind energy, wave energy, they are in no danger of running out. Okay, let's move on to saving and investment. If we save more and put those savings into a bank account, what happens is the bank usually lends that out to make money. That's how banks make money, by taking whatever you deposit with them and lending it out at a higher rate. So if you put more money in the bank, that means the bank's going to be able to lend more money out. And who does it lend to? It lends mostly to corporations. Those corporations can then expand. That means they can buy more capital. That means they're investing. So that's how saving and investment are related. The trouble is, there's a trade-off, what Keynes originally called the paradox of saving. The paradox of saving. Why? Because saving, we're always taught, is good for us. The more you save, the less you're going to have to worry about your future. And actually, that's the theme of Republicans right now, interestingly, but of the Republican Party, I should say. But there is a trade-off here in macroeconomic terms, because if we as individuals save more, then we're going to consume less, then the economy is going to grow less. So you can see there's a paradox there. From a macro point of view, we're always told to spend more to support the macroeconomy, to support the economy in general. From a micro point of view, we're always told to save more, because that generally ensures a more comfortable retirement and a better future. So there is a trade-off here. So, as I said, if we have a higher savings rate, that means there's going to be fewer resources to make consumption goods now, but there's going to be more resources that go through the banking system. So we deposit more in the bank, or leave more of our current paycheck in the bank. The bank's going to be able to loan more out. The bank loaning more out will mean that more companies get loans to expand, and when they expand, they buy more plant machinery and equipment generally when they expand, so that's more capital goods. So you can see the trade-off here is between consumption goods and capital goods if we save more. Now, of course, if we buy more capital goods, we invest, in other words, or the corporations that have lent that money, that lent those funds by the bank invest, then capital stock's going to increase. The amount of capital we have in the economy will increase. Now, if we have more capital, that means we should have rising productivity, and more rapid growth in GDP. But with each extra unit of capital, what happens is that the benefit from each of those extra units of capital declines as the amount of capital that we have increases. So in the long run, higher savings rate gives you a high level of productivity, a higher level of income, but not higher growth in productivity or a higher growth in income. It still leads to growth, so a percentage change is still positive, but it's not at such a higher level. How do we know that? Well, in economics we use what's called a production function to show that. So on the horizontal axis we see the output for every worker. On the vertical axis we see the output per worker. The horizontal axis, by the way, is mislabeled. That should read capital per worker on the horizontal axis, not output. So horizontal axis, you have to change that slide. It reads capital per worker. So the point is, if we have a small amount of capital per worker, say, can you see that purple, pink triangle at the bottom of the curve with 1 on the horizontal section of it? If we're at the bottom bottom left-hand side of that triangle, and we increase the amount of capital per worker, so that's the horizontal axis, we move along the horizontal axis by 1 unit, we get a big boost in output. So that means the vertical part here is positive. When we have a lot of capital already, we increase capital by 1 unit per worker, so another tractor per worker, but we've already got a lot of tractors. Then we get more output, but the increase in output is a lot less. You can see the vertical distance is a lot less. What's going on there? Well, what it's saying is that when you're a poor country and you don't have much capital, when you add another tractor, that can boost your output by a lot. When you're already a rich country and you have tons of tractors, then adding another tractor is not going to make that much difference. So the red triangle to the right hand side, much further up the curve. That's called diminishing returns, by the way. So in other words, for each additional unit of capital, as you add more capital, the bang for adding another unit of capital, the bang for the buck if you like, is going to fall. We see this, by the way, in a lot of students ask me, well, give us another example of this. Well, studying. The first hour that you study, so that would be on the horizontal axis, the hours per student, for instance. The first hour that you study, the amount of information that you learn is a lot. So the vertical distance on that triangle to the bottom is a lot. Now your 8th hour of studying, the extra information that you gain has fallen. So we get this diminishing returns in a lot of activities in life. Now if we're at the bottom of that production function, when we add a tractor, as I said, we get a lot of extra output. So countries that start off poor are going to tend to grow more rapidly. When we're at the top of that curve, when we add another tractor, we get only a little bit more output. So when we're adding a unit of capital in the rich countries, the growth rate will only go up by a small amount. So what it tells you is that the smaller countries, the poorer countries, who are down the bottom of that curve, in other words to the left part of the production function, are the countries that where they can add capital, they're going to grow at a lot faster rate than the countries at the top part of that curve. That's the effect of so-called diminishing returns. So poor countries already have lower productivity, but the small amounts of capital investment can increase workers' productivity substantially. Think of it this way. My tractor example in a poor country. In a rich country, you buy another tractor, or a farmer buys another tractor. he's probably only going to use that tractor on his own fields. Now, in a developing country, typically what happens when a farmer buys a tractor, he will also rent that tractor out to other farmers who don't have tractors. So that tractor is going to be used a lot of different farms. The rich countries have high productivity, so their additional capital investment is going to only have a small effect on productivity. And the general result here with diminishing returns on what's called the convergence effect is that poorer countries should grow faster than richer countries. By the way, that's one reason why you shouldn't be surprised when I say China is growing really fast. It's growing at 9% per annum. That's the low estimates anyway. Many of them are above that. You shouldn't be surprised about that because China is still a relatively poor country compared to the US. So it should be growing faster than the US. What can help countries, particularly poor countries, that don't have the funds to invest? We talked before about, saying that if we save more, that allows for more investment, more capital to be added to the current capital stock. One of the problems in poor countries is that, most people don't have the funds to put aside to save. They're struggling just to feed themselves day by day. So another way in which those poorer countries can get investment is to attract it from abroad. When that's done, it's called foreign direct investment. And this is capital investment that's owned and operated by a foreign entity. There's also foreign portfolio investment. So this is where a foreign company decides to take over a domestic company. That's also basically a foreign takeover of a domestic company. That's also useful for the economy and a good way to get to maintain investment in the country. So what are the benefits from investment? Obviously, there's going to be some return if it's a foreign entity owning the business, some return back to the foreign capital owners. But it also increases the economy's stock of capital. If it's a takeover of a domestic firm, it means that those resources, once the takeover has occurred, can be put to use by producing something else within that country. It leads to higher productivity, higher wages, and usually state-of-the-art technologies. In many of these poor countries, they love to get foreign direct investment from foreign countries, foreign developed countries, because they get usually machinery and equipment that's cutting edge and much better than what they can get hold of. The World Bank is also instrumental in helping the poorer countries attract capital, and it encourages the flow of capital to those poor countries from the rich countries. It gets its funds from the world's advanced countries. It makes loans to the less developed countries, and most of those loans are for specific projects like roads, sewerage systems, schools, and other types of capital, water supply, etc. And obviously it provides advice about how the funds can be best used. World Bank, by the way, is based in Washington, D.C., and it's also has a partner institution called the International Monetary Fund. The World Bank looks at kind of micro level projects, so as I said, funding things like new roads, dams, sewers, the infrastructure capital of the country. The IMF does macro type loans. Both of them were set up after World War II in the mountain resort, ski resort of Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. And the main purpose of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund is to promote stability and growth, economic growth in the world economies, so that we can all grow and become more prosperous. Why? Because the opposite, if we didn't have those institutions, we found out what that was like between the two world wars in the last century. We had political turmoil, the rise of the Nazis, the rise of the communists, international tensions, and of course it led to military conflict in the Second World War. So I don't think anyone wants to go back to that interwar period where we didn't really have any effective international institutions. So that's physical capital, and what's embodied in physical capital, that's technology, and that leads to productivity increases. That leads to growth. When we look at labor, what's embodied in labor, well, one of the main things is obviously education, along with skills and experience, if you remember. So education. Education is really investment in human capital. Now here I'm not using the word investment properly, because investment should be a new plant, machinery and equipment, but you understand the idea. Adding, I would use the word adding to human capital there. And it explains the gap between the wages of educated and uneducated workers. Educated workers have more human capital. And also, there's an opportunity cost, of course, of becoming an educated worker, which you're going through right now. That is, you lose wages in the process of getting an education. But having the degree, as we know, conveys positive externalities. So in other words, you have the degree, it means that hiring you is going to benefit the company more than hiring someone who doesn't have a degree. Otherwise, why would they give you more money for having the degree? And those positive externalities can be significant. That's why most of you will earn, I think it's roughly 6 times what you would earn without a degree, on average. And that's why, because of those externalities, the public sector has a role to play, and that's why we have public education, and that's why Texas A&M Corpus Christi exists. And large subsidies are given to the university in the form of state funding to ensure that we do get human capital investment in this part of the country and all over the countries. One of the big problems for many countries is when they educate workers if they leave. And that's typical for poorer countries. Poorer countries often spend a lot of money educating doctors only to find that they get jobs in other countries. That's very frustrating for those poorer countries because they have put and they have subsidized those students with state money, and they find that they leave the country. We look at human capital. We talked about education. Obviously, a workforce that's healthier can work for longer and have less days off. So, that's also a positive aspect to the labor force. Healthier workers tend to be more productive, and of course the wages reflect a worker's productivity, or should do. So doing the right investments in the health of the population should lead to an increase in productivity as well and raise living standards. So this is why there's an emphasis in many countries on better nutrition. Denmark in Europe has just instituted a saturated fat tax, and it's on all foods which have over a certain percentage of saturated fats in them. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to encourage their population to be more healthy, but in the same way that should increase the productivity because they'll have less days off for workers who are sick because they are obese and overweight. Already there are studies that have been done that find that taller workers tend to get higher wages, and the reason why is they tend to be healthier and they tend to therefore give firms better productivity. There's a vicious circle the other way in poor countries. Poor countries are poor, and that means they can't afford to fund the health systems very well in those countries, and that means the population isn't healthy, and that means that they remain poor. So that's the argument there. And you can get these, instead of a vicious circle, a virtuous circle. Policies that lead to more rapid economic growth would naturally improve health outcomes, which in turn promote further economic growth. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that the US has been so, how can I put it, so pressed in terms of reforming its healthcare system. The reason why is that we do need a healthcare system that works well and that is not over expensive, but leads to healthy outcomes amongst the population, so that we can reduce the number of sick days, make our labour force more productive. So that's health. Second impact that you get on economic growth comes from property rights and political stability. Protecting property rights is very important. If you own something, if you own a business, then you don't want the government coming in and taking it away from you, or you don't want anyone else claiming that they own it or have a right to that business or some stake in that business. So protecting property rights is very important in any country, and the courts are there to enforce those property rights. In countries like Zimbabwe, for instance, which is above South Africa, there's been a lot of problems with this because the government has a land reform scheme where they are trying to distribute the farms that used to belong to the white farmers in Zimbabwe to the mostly black farmers, and this has created a lot of problems. Often the white farmers have been forced off their land in the middle of the night, and they've gone to the courts to try and reclaim that land, and the courts have denied them that right, saying that the government program takes precedence over their private ownership of the land. So obviously that doesn't instill a whole load of confidence in anyone wanting to invest in Zimbabwe, because what it says is that if the government wants that, it'll just take it. So that doesn't promote political stability, obviously, and Zimbabwe has been a very unstable country. Same thing, by the way, is going on in South America right now. So property rights are really important for the market system to work. We've got to know who owns what, and if there's a dispute over it, it's got to be resolved in courts in a fair way. So if you don't have that, if you don't have the property rights going on, it's a major problem. Contracts don't get enforced. So you've got bogus land claims, like in Zimbabwe. They're bogus because there's no way of really enforcing them, and there's a lot of claims that are made as well for land which are just they're false claims, but the court upholds them because they're scared of the consequence of not upholding those claims, because the claims come from people who are part of Robert Mugabe's government. In transition economies as well, contracts were hard to enforce. Transition economies are economies that come from a centrally planned system, a communist, usually political system as well, to a market-based system and a capitalist political system. What happens there is that, of course, the state has owned has had full ownership over the means of production during the centrally planned period, and in many cases the policy has been to give the companies to the workers, but sometimes people come forward saying, that was my grandfather's company, and it was taken off them by the communists when they came to power, and I want that back. So you had also some conflict there in the transition economies. Trouble is, trying to get the bottom of who owns what can be difficult in terms of the historical evidence, and fraud can go unpunished very easily. But in general, corruption impedes the coordination of markets. It discourages domestic saving, and certainly if you have a lot of corruption in the country, it discourages investment from abroad. The biggest threat, I would say, to property rights comes from political instability. Political instability may, saying that the government's unstable. It maybe has taken power and does not respect what's happening at the ballot box. In other words, it's not really democratically elected. So you get things like revolutions and coups happening there. A revolutionary government might confiscate the capital of some businesses. So it gives the domestic residents more concern over what their future is in the country, and many of them start planning to have a second home somewhere else so that if it gets bad they can get out. Foreigners obviously have less incentive to come to that country. Now, we've also, as economists, done a lot of research on what tends to promote growth in a country, and free trade also has a positive effect on growth. We're going to look at that now. Most countries in the past have had what we call inward-oriented policies. In other words, they've avoided interaction with the rest of the world. And usually the argument has been, oh, we've got these industries and they're growing, and we don't really think that they should be competing with foreign firms right now because they're at a much smaller, they're much earlier stage of development, and other types of trade restrictions. We'd lose jobs if we have to compete openly with the rest of the world. That actually has been shown to have an adverse effect on economic growth. So the more outward-oriented policies would be to say, okay, we're going to integrate into the world economy, we're going to get rid of some of the trade barriers that we have, or all of the trade barriers that we have, and usually that results in more economic growth. So the amount of trade can be determined by government policy. So for instance, in some countries they have export subsidies. In poorer countries, South Korea is one country that's really done that as a policy, had export subsidies in the past. And obviously geography matters as well, because the amount of trade that a country can do that has a seaport is probably going to be a lot higher, quite a bit higher than the country that's completely landlocked. In terms of the country itself and the capital it has, and the quality of it, we also have to look at government policies and also culture kind of thing to do with the development and the pursuit of knowledge. Knowledge is really what we call a public good. Everyone can benefit from it once it happens. So for instance, the use of the internet, when it was invented, then it became a public good. In other words, everyone could make use of it for whatever purpose they wanted. So it became a platform, and a lot of knowledge is like that. And the government likes to encourage that type of knowledge because it can lead to a lot of new products and can lead to growth. And they have a role there really because of the externalities associated with developing some of these things, like the internet was developed by the government. You probably don't know this, but it was not Al Gore who invented the internet, despite his claims. He was involved in it. He sponsored a bill that gave funding for the project that was a military project to fund a network, basically, in case of nuclear attack, so that you could communicate with whatever bits of the network were left. Well, that's how the internet works, through email, and from there the internet was developed basically by a bunch of university researchers working for the military, and the rest of the story. We all use the internet now, so it's very important that the government does allow these kinds of projects, which would not otherwise get funded, because no one can see the actual potential there necessarily that early in the stage of developing it. Aerospace research is also important. I mean, from the research that NASA's done, for instance, there's lots of products come out. Tempur-Pedic is one of the products that came out from NASA research for beds on spaceships. And the numerous research grants that the government gives to encourage innovative and new research. National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health are the two biggest foundations that the government has, the US government has. Also tax breaks that all corporations that do research are given, And there's also the patent system. In other words, if you do discover a new product, you can patent it. And once you've patented it, you have a legal right to pursue anyone else who you think copies your invention. In terms of population, obviously certain countries, developing countries like India, for instance, have very large populations. They have more workers to produce goods and services, so they get a larger total output of goods and services, and they also have more consumers. So it's becoming very important, by the way, for our corporations to get into those markets which have very large numbers of consumers, because potentially if they grow quite rapidly, then there's going to be a lot of benefits. So China and India are obviously good examples of where American corporations are trying to make sure that they are in those markets. One of the problems in population growth is that, of course, each head of population is going to consume some resources, and it does stretch natural resources. We're seeing that with water right now. There was an economist, well, more a philosopher, back in the, I think it was 19th century, called Thomas Malthus, who actually predicted that if we had an ever-increasing population, that eventually we couldn't grow anymore, because mankind would basically run out of those natural resources and would be doomed to live forever in poverty. That's what he predicted. So far, Malthus's prediction has not come true, of course, which is good. If we do have, in those poorer countries, if we do have high population growth and the capital stock doesn't grow at the same rate, obviously the amount of capital that each head of population works with will fall. That can lead to lower productivity per worker and lower GDP per growth. So it's important in those countries that have high population growth, and there's other countries in Africa that also have high population growth, to make sure that their capital stock grows at a similar rate. Some countries have viewed this the other way around and said, okay, our population is growing too fast, let's curb our population growth. The most famous of that, famous version of that, is the one family, one child policy of China, because they were worried about their large population growing to unsustainable levels. One of the things about that some people have countered Malthus's prediction with is to say that, the more population we have, though, the more inventors we'll have, the more technological progress we have, and the fact that our resources will start running out at some point, the more ingenuity we'll have to discover either new resources which we can use, or better conservation from the current resources that we use on the planet. So some people view this as an engine, the rapid growth in the world's population, as an engine for technological progress, and hence more prosperity. Okay, that's the end of this screencast. Thanks for sticking around, and I'll be posting the next one soon. Thank you.